very loud. I've always been loud. So I'm very happy to be here to use my live voice and just talk quickly through some things I've learned in my life here. I belong to the batch of 1994, a year ahead of Anita. And my journey to CMC and from CMC to here was probably a little different from most people. I did not know what CMC was when I joined it, honest to God. My mom's a nurse, and so I wanted to be a nurse, and she begged me not to be one. And I said, well, the other option is I will apply for the Armed Forces Medical College, and I'll go to med school there. And she said no. So I said, well, then you have to let me be a nurse. And I loved it. I knew it to be my calling from the time I was in high school, probably 10th, 11th grade. There was no doubt. Like, that's one thing that God made very clear, even in my young life, that that's something I was called to be. So there was no confusion about what I wanted to be when I grew up. The confusion was where I wanted to be growing up. And I actually applied to SNDT in Bombay. That's where I grew up. I got the admission there, and that's the time I learned about CMC because somebody randomly mentioned it at church. And he's like, have you heard of CMC? I'm like, nope, have no clue. They said, why don't you just apply and see what happens? Wrote the entrance. I went to Katpadi, like Asha Cheji said. Wrote the entrance. I actually got an interview call. And the day I was leaving for my interview, my mom said, well, you already got admission, like I've paid the first month's fees at SNDT. She's like, even if you get in, don't stay, come back. And I'm like, well, let's see how that goes. And on the way there, we stopped at Chennai, and my cousin lives there, and they're like, who's sponsoring you? I'm like, sponsor? What sponsor? They're like, did you know that it's very hard to get in there without a sponsor? And here I am trying to figure out what sponsorship means, no clue. So I went there, I'm like, oh, I'll just listen to mom and come back, I probably won't even make it. And I was one of 2 open seats that got into the batch of 94. And my journey from there to here started when I was in school. And I was sharing with Alice Andy on our way here that that's probably never happened in the history of CMC College of Nursing, and probably won't again. I was in 3rd year of nursing in my program when, through family, my uncle had applied in the 70s for us to move as a family over here. The papers were frozen. My parents decided not to move without everybody, moving as a unit. So it all processed and came to pass in 93, 4-ish. I was in 1st year, and by the time everything came through, it was 96. And I'm like, I'm in the middle of college. My brother is doing 1st year engineering. There's no way we can take time off. And they said, well, try. So I sent a letter to the dean. She said no. And the day of the interview, when we have to be at the consulate, 2 days before, so Friday that week, it so happens that the dean is out, and Mrs. Alice Nyanamuthu was the deputy dean, and she was sitting in, and she said, okay, so my letter went to her desk. She said, I know this has been rejected, but since you've asked again and I am here, I will okay it this time. I cannot promise what's going to happen to the next 2 times. And as God would have it, I'm an idiot at that point. I don't know what this all means. So I'm like, well, it's, okay if we go, okay if it, whatever. So I came for the interview. We went, the first one is done. A couple of weeks later, same thing. Our dean wasn't there, and Mrs. Nyanamuthu signed it. I came for my 2nd one. So here I am, my visa's in hand. We are traveling in a few more weeks, and I have no clearance to get like 3 months off to come in the middle of the school year. And so our fabulous teachers then, I remember, I don't know what all happened behind the scenes, but I know God worked through people that he placed in my life at that time. It was Mrs. Pramila Lee, Mrs. Selva Chaco, Mrs. Nyanamuthu. They all, I think, spoke as one voice and says, this is a chance for her to go. She doesn't realize what she has. So then they agreed to let me go. I had to take a break in my studies, came here, got my extension. So I didn't have a bond right after internship. I flew over, started my career essentially in the US. But I have to say that whatever I learned as a CMC graduate has pretty much undergirded my practice all this time. I started as fun fact, since Anita mentioned it, we, at that time in the 90s, we became aware of advanced practice in the US. And I can tell you that that whole generation was impacted by that idea of advanced practice in nursing. And we used to joke, because I loved L&D, and I like when we would sit in our common floor at CMC, that was a running joke, because they said Ambali's going to be the first certified nurse midwife when she gets to the US, because I was so ready, like when I was in school, that's what I wanted to do. But God had other plans for me, and the final year, you know, when you have to give your options, when you have to do your internship or where they place you, I said L&D to be my first choice, then I said ER, and then I said ICU. Guess what? I was not in any of those places. They put me in plastics and reconstructive surgery and burns, not even on my radar. And I come to find out that year we were hosting the National Burn Conference, and people who know me know that I'm like a jack of all trades, so they needed somebody to help organize, and which is why Beulah ma'am, who was over that department, said put her in there. So I ended up helping host the National Burn Conference that year, and I learned a ton. And so that experience stayed with me. And fast forward over here, going the nurse midwife route was a little difficult, and my first break was MICU in MICU, and I loved medicine. ICU anyway. I'm like, this is something I can do, and 6 years later I got my acute care NP. I've been a nurse practitioner for the last 17 years. Neuroscience is my passion. I've done neurocritical care for the whole time that I've been a nurse practitioner. And as of 2.5 months now, I have a new role, which is absolutely terrifying. I've taken up the lead nurse practitioner role with Methodist Hospital at one of their entities. It's a growing program. We currently have 10 nurse practitioners, so I'm like the lead over that program. But my role is dual. The hospital is also going for comprehensive stroke certification, which means instead of just doing medical management for strokes, they are doing neurosurgery piece. And I'm supposed to be the clinical expert for the hospital, so as we build the process, policies, talking to people, keeping the physicians in line so they don't upset the rest of the admin. So all that kind of falls in my plate. It's not a role that's structured. I'm building structure as I go. All this to say that I've been in clinical practice for 17 years, and people have asked me why I haven't moved into leadership already. And I tell them that I was in school, like my dad was always a perfectionist. Like he said, if there is better possible, good is not enough. So I take a report card when I was little, Dad, I made a 99, what happened to the other two? That was his question. So that's how I was raised. And at CMC, guess what? I felt like I was always bottom of the chain when it comes to academic excellence. Like I went to school with phenomenal women. I never felt I could ever match up to them. And as God would have it, I actually worked with a bunch of NPs that were just as high functioning. They're all in leadership roles. They're either, one's a CNO, one's a CEO. Like they've moved up, and we all started together. So having done school with a bunch of phenomenal women, and then having worked with women who are just as strong, I never felt I could measure up. I never felt that I had anything to offer to anybody. And having stepped into this lead role, 2 months ago, we were talking about doing TED Talks, and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna say, talk about. And then this role truly made me look at something we as women of color, tend to deal with and are not even aware of, and that's imposter syndrome. And I didn't know there was a name for what I felt. Like this inadequacy, somebody calls you up, am I able to do the job? Absolutely. So they asked me again, and I'm living in this constant kind of fear, worry that they'll find out that I don't know what I'm talking about. They'll find out. And the more I talk to women physicians who, then done fellowships, now they're attending physicians or leaders in their field, and I started talking to these women, and every single one of them said the same thing. Our experience putting this program together, when I talked to my classmates, guess what, 49, there's about 25 of us here, every single one of them is master's prepared. Every single one of them I asked, said, I don't think there's nothing I can contribute. And I realized the magnitude of this problem that we as women of color, we face because of the cultural situation we came from. And honestly, I'll tell you, this whole thing just came together in this maybe past couple of hours while I was driving up here to actually tell you guys what I felt like, where I am in my life and what I feel. And that is what I feel. This constant fear of I'm not good enough. I don't have anything to contribute. I can't, but then you're forced into a situation and you know you are. And you know there is enough in you to bring there. And one of the things, and this I learned from the personal challenges I went through with my family with having kids, is that if God brought you to something, He intended for it to happen, and you're enough. And this lesson I learned in a very big way with my kids. I had a lot of personal issues keeping my pregnancies, not getting pregnant, but carrying them to term. So I've had 3 losses, late first trimester, early second trimester, 3 of them prior to Samuel. And I used to worry about them when they were kids, especially Samuel. And then God brought me to a point where He said, think about it this way. I didn't create you to be their mom. I didn't create kids for you. I created a mom for the kids. God knew they were coming, and God knew exactly what kind of mom they needed. So I was a thought for them. If my God can think that Samuel needs a mom exactly like me, and even if I think I'm a hot mess, God knew that hot mess is enough for them. I'm not worried anymore. I mean, I constantly worry about, am I breaking my children? The same worry, am I breaking this role? What are people thinking of me? But once I learned that lesson, that He made me for them, all that is gone. So I'm in this role, and I'm like, He made me for this role. This role was, He knew it's coming, and He's like, oh, Emily's there, that's where she's going. So once I learned that, a lot of this imposter syndrome kind of went away. And I'm going to speak to a room full of high-functioning women. Don't look at your success as, oh, I only practiced for this bit, or I haven't done anything. Look at it as, God brought you to this place. He's given you what you need to what He's bringing ahead of you, the road He's going to show you to walk. Imposter syndrome, like, it happens to people who usually are high functioning, people who are perfectionists. Thanks to my dad, I tend to be one. Nothing's ever good enough. My kids, they can attest to that. It's not good enough ever. But then that means that I'm putting a lot of burden on myself. I won't let anybody take that burden from me. I'm very bad at delegating. I learned. Now I trust people to, I'm going to give it to you. This is your mess. Deal with it. And I'm going to step away, and I'm going to give myself grace, like Anita said, that I'm going to trust that they will rise to that challenge. That's that part of being an perfectionist. And these are types that people who have studied this since the 70s show that imposter syndrome, people fall into one of these 5 categories. Then there's the superwoman. I know you all can attest to what being a superwoman is like. You want to do everything and be everything to everybody. And it's not possible, right? So when you fail, when you have that high standard of you and you fail, that is preventing you from fulfilling so much of what God created you to do. Then there is an expert, same thing, you're supposed to know what you're doing, and you're looking at others. You might be the pioneer in this field. You might be the first one to have stepped into that role, and you are the expert. Own it, and if you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know, but you got there by learning, by what you've already gained in these past 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever, how many ever years, you got there. So you are an expert. Own that. You have something to say. And there's I'm always constantly checking myself, right? Okay, I'm gonna be honest and say that I don't know. One of the things I was able to learn is that I need to ask for feedback. So early in my career, I would ask people to give me feedback. I did not know this, but one of the pharmacists pointed out that when somebody brings something to you and you think you're the expert and you're a perfectionist, when there's a fallout, you haven't performed to how you think you should have performed, you get defensive. I'm like, total blind spot. I did not know that. And that's true. I would get defensive. I'll try to, kind of justify. And in my head, I'm trying to explain that I thought through the process, but to them it sounded defensive. So now I choose my words wisely, and I'm like, okay, thank you for pointing that out. Taking criticism was not easy for that expert. So that's my journey, and that's how I'm learning. It's a process of dealing with imposter syndrome, and this new role has really challenged me to look at this and say, okay, there are things you don't know, and that's okay, but you're here and God has brought you here for a reason. So step up to the plate and do your thing. And the second piece to this is you are leaders, every single one of you here. You are leaders in spite of your challenges. You are women. And imposter syndrome was first recognized and studied in women in the 70s. You are women of color, and that adds a second layer. And when you say, you have to deal with your imposter syndrome, you're trying to fix yourself. But there's a bigger goal, a picture. There's bias against you, whether recognized or unrecognized. And I think we as leaders have to step into that space and say, okay, check your bias, okay? I might have imposter syndrome, I'm dealing with mine, but there is a bias. I'm a woman, so I'm not supposed to know what I know. I'm a woman of color, so I'm not supposed to be the way I am. You cannot be loud, especially Indian women. You have to, I'm getting on my soapbox here, because when you're a woman, an Indian woman for that, you need to know how to run a household, you need to know how to raise a family, you need to have a career, none of those expectations are laid on our male counterparts to the extent that and you have to do all of this without coming off as bossy, which is what I've been called a lot of times. So I mean, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? So, but so instead of fixing myself and say I'm bossy, I'm like, sorry, I'm a woman, yes, I'm not supposed to know it, but I know, and I am able to lead. That's not my problem, that's yours. So let's check your bias. So here I'm leaving you with two things. A, recognize that we all deal with this. B, that you're leaders. Speak to your sisters. Speak to your colleagues. Tell them, hey, you're here. You have what it takes to do this. Step up and do it. And may God bless you.